The desk was Earl's. It always had been. Ruth Maddox had not opened that center drawer since the morning of March 14, 1997, when the paramedics left with her husband and the house went quiet in a way she had never heard before. 41 years of marriage, and she had never once noticed the silence of that house. She had always thought silence was peaceful. She understood now she had been wrong about that. It was April 4th, 3 weeks and 2 days after Earl's stroke, when she finally opened the drawer. She was looking for the deed. The county clerk had called twice about the title transfer and the probate filing. Ruth had put it off as long as she could, but the forms were due by the 9th, and Connie had found someone at the county office who said they could walk her through it if she brought the right papers. What Ruth found, folded inside a manila envelope behind the deed, stopped her cold. It was a loan renewal document, signed August 12, 1996. Earl W. Maddox, borrower. First Farmers Bank of Antlers, lender. The amount, $127,000. Secured against the property at Route 3, Pushmataha County, Oklahoma. The full 380 acres. Ruth had known about the operating loan. Earl had always carried one. That was just farming, the way you carried a tractor payment or a fuel bill that grew in dry years. But the last time they had spoken about it, really spoken the way you speak about serious things at a kitchen table, the balance had been closer to $40,000. She had not known he had rolled it this large. She had not known the collateral was the land itself. There was a note clipped to the document in Earl's handwriting. It said only, "Review meeting. First Farmers, November 1997. Renewal likely. Do not panic if I'm not here." He had written it in January. Ruth sat at that desk for a long time. Has there ever been a week, maybe just 1 week, where you genuinely did not know if your family was going to make it? Not vague worry. The kind where the numbers were real and the deadline was close, and the ground felt like it was shifting under everything you'd built. You don't have to give me the details. Just tell me what year that was for you. For Ruth Maddox, that year was 1997, and the week was the first week of April. The worst part was not the number on the page. The worst part was the date Earl had written that note. January, for months before his death. He had known this might fall to her. He had tried, in his way, to prepare her. She just didn't know what she was being prepared for. The Maddox place sat at the end of a gravel road on the western edge of Pushmataha County, about 11 miles from Antlers, Oklahoma. You turned off Highway 2, crossed a cattle guard that rattled in a particular way when you drove over it at any speed, and followed a half-mile of red caliche that turned to mud for 2 weeks every spring. The land had been in Earl's family since 1931. His grandfather, Don Maddox, had bought 200 acres for back taxes in the middle of the Depression, a purchase that seemed so unlikely at the time that people in Antlers still mention it when the old families came up in conversation. Earl's father had added the eastern 180 acres in 1963, a deal made on a handshake with a man named Foley, who was moving his family to Amarillo and needed the sale to happen quickly. 380 acres of red clay and blackjack oaks, and a creek bottom that silted every spring and flooded every decade, whether you had planned for it or not. Earl had farmed it the way his father had. Winter wheat in the fall, hay ground through the summer, a cow-calf operation that ran about 55 head in a good year. The barn, a wide, cedar-smelling 2-bay structure his grandfather had built with milled timber hauled in from the eastern Oklahoma hills, was the oldest building on the property. Earl said the barn was the reason the farm felt like a farm and not just a piece of land with a house on it. He had said that more times than Ruth could count. She had always agreed with him. Earl was 62 when he died. He had the kind of body that farm work builds over 4 decades, wide-shouldered, deliberate in his movements, arthritic in both hands by November every year. He had not been to the doctor the way he should have. Ruth had said so more than once. He would nod and move past her in the kitchen as if she hadn't spoken at all, which was its own kind of silence, different from the one she was living in now, but kin to it. They had 2 children. Dale was 36. He had left Antlers at 18, earned a business degree from Oklahoma State, and spent the last decade in Tulsa managing inventory logistics for a regional distribution company. He visited at Thanksgiving and called on birthdays. He had 2 daughters, both under 10, and a wife named Tamara who had grown up in Stillwater and had never set foot on a working farm. Dale loved his father. Ruth believed that fully. But he had built a life that did not include the land, and he had stopped pretending otherwise sometime around 1991. Connie was 33. She had stayed. She had her reasons. A marriage that lasted 8 years and ended quietly in 1994, no children, a part-time bookkeeping job in Antlers for a trucking company that ran behind on its own payments. But the real reason Connie had stayed, Ruth knew, was the same reason some people stay anywhere. She did not know who she would be somewhere else, and she had never wanted to find out. Connie had worked the farm alongside Earl for years. She knew how to drive the old John Deere 4240 and run the hay baler without pinching the windrow. She knew when to cut and when to wait and when the weather was about to turn even before the radio said so. She had Earl's patience with the land and Earl's stubbornness, and about 80% of Earl's silence. Is there something you wish you had said to your father or your grandfather about the land, about the work, about how much it all cost them? Some of you carry that. I see you. Leave it in the comments if you want. You don't have to explain the whole thing. Earl and Connie had an understanding that didn't need words. Ruth had always been grateful for it. But sitting at that desk in April with a $127,000 loan document in her hands, Ruth understood for the first time that the silence between Earl and Connie might have also meant I didn't tell her everything either. Dale came down the following Saturday, April 12th. Ruth had not asked him to come. Connie had called him. That fact alone, Connie picking up the phone to call Dale, told Ruth how serious things had gotten inside her daughter's head. Dale sat at the kitchen table with the loan documents spread across the oilcloth and studied them the way he studied inventory reports. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked Ruth if she knew what a collateral review was. She said she knew enough. He said, "Mom, what this means is that the bank is already looking at the acreage. Not just the balance, the land itself. They're going to want to know whether the farm can support renewal, and they'll make that call before November. The crop rental won't make them comfortable. The cow-calf operation won't either, not at 55 head with spring wheat at current prices." Ruth asked how far in the hole they actually were. Dale picked up the operating note. The original balance was $127,000. Accrued interest since August would put it closer to $130,000 now. The farm's last certified appraisal on file. He found a copy tucked into the same manila envelope. Valued the 380 acres at $181,000 in 1994. Land values in Pushmataha County had not moved much since, which meant the bank held the better part of 5 decades of family's equity as collateral, and they knew exactly what they held. Connie said, "That appraisal was a drought year. The place is worth more than that." Dale said, "It doesn't matter what it's worth to us." That was when the conversation stopped being about numbers. The winter wheat was already in the ground. Earl had planted it in October before he died. Planted his last crop the way he planted every crop, with the full attention of a man who understood that the land did not forgive carelessness. About 140 acres of Berta Red, same variety he'd grown for 20 years. It needed one more good rain and a clean harvest in June. If prices held, Spring wheat was running around $3.80 a bushel in Oklahoma that spring. A decent yield might produce somewhere between $28,000 and $34,000 gross. It was not enough, not even close to enough. Dale said it plainly. He said they could list the property, get fair market value, pay off the note, and Ruth and Connie would walk away with something real rather than spend the next 7 months in fear and still lose. He said he had a contact at a real estate firm in Antlers that handled farmland. He said he could make the call that afternoon. Connie said no before he finished the sentence. Did you ever watch a parent work a piece of land so hard it scared you? Not just tired, the kind of tired that becomes something permanent. That gets into their posture and their face and doesn't come out again. Leave a comment. I'd like to know what you remember about them. Connie had watched Earl plant that October crop with a hip that had stopped cooperating 2 years earlier and hands that shook in the cold before the sun got up. She had not called Dale to tell him. Dale had not been here to see it, and she was not about to stand in Earl's kitchen on a Saturday afternoon and let this man with a real estate contact in Antlers make a phone call that undid what Earl had given his body to keep. Ruth did not say anything yet, but she was sitting at the end of that table, and she heard every word, and she was already deciding. The note in January was not the only paper Ruth had not been shown. In the weeks after that Saturday, Ruth went through the desk more carefully. Not because she had grown suspicious of Earl. She never thought of Earl as a man who kept secrets in a self-serving way. She went through it because Earl had left his whole life in that desk, and somebody had to do the accounting. She found the payment history first. Earl had been making reduced payments on the note since 1993. Not defaulting, never missing a payment, but paying the interest and a portion of the principal each year, rolling the balance forward by agreement. The bank had allowed it. First Farmers had worked with the Maddox family across 3 generations, and Bud Hargrove, the loans officer Earl had dealt with for decades, knew Earl from FFA at Antlers High School way back in 1952. Bud Hargrove knew what 380 acres of Maddox land meant in this county. He had given Earl the room to manage it the way Earl's family had always managed things, quietly, persistently, without drama. Bud Hargrove had retired in December 1996. The new loans officer at the Antlers branch was a man named Travis Kidd, 31 years old, a degree from the University of Oklahoma, transferred in for the bank's main office in Durant 9 months earlier. He had no history with the Maddox place. No FFA memory. No story about Don Maddox buying land for back taxes during the Depression. What he had was a quarterly review schedule and a loan portfolio he was accountable to, and the Maddox operating note was on his list. Ruth found this out from Edna Cowles, who worked the front desk at First Farmers and had gone to church with Earl and Ruth since 1969. Edna called in late April, not officially, just to check on Ruth. And somewhere in the conversation, careful, measured, the way women of a certain generation say important things sideways, Edna said, "Ruth, Bud would have renewed without blinking. But Bud ain't here anymore." That was when Ruth understood that the problem was not just a number. The problem was that the human bridge between the Maddox family and that institution had been taken out, and what remained on the other side was a man with a spreadsheet and no reason to feel anything particular about 380 acres of red clay in Pushmataha County. There was something else in the desk. A letter dated February 7th, 1997, 5 weeks before Earl's stroke, from Travis Kidd's office, requesting a collateral review meeting in advance of the November renewal, asking Earl to respond by March 15th. Earl's stroke was on March 14th. He had never responded. Ruth sat with that letter for a long time. She thought about Earl reading it in February. She thought about him writing the January note at this same desk. She thought about him planting that October wheat with his bad hip. She tried to map it. When had he known this was serious? When had the worry settled into something he couldn't put down? And why had he not told her? She could not make herself angry at him. She had tried once or twice in the way you try on anger when grief is too heavy to carry alone. It didn't fit. Earl had carried things himself his whole life. That was who he was. That was the farm working through a person. And you do not get angry at a man for being exactly who he always was. She cried that night, after Connie had driven home and the house was quiet the way it was quiet now. She cried for the weight he had carried without her, and for the weight she was carrying now without him. Ruth Maddox had attended Assembly of God services in Antlers since she was 11 years old. She had never been the kind of woman who wore faith loudly. She did not put Bible verses on her mailbox or talk about prayer in casual conversation. Faith for Ruth was like the root system of a blackjack oak, mostly underground, invisible to anybody passing by, holding everything up without advertising itself. But in the third week of May, after Dale had stopped calling every few days and Connie had gone quiet in the way that meant she was already working, Ruth drove to the church on a Tuesday morning. Not for a service, just to sit in the building. The doors were unlocked Tuesday mornings for the women's sewing circle, and nobody said anything when Ruth came in and sat down in the fourth pew from the front, which was where she and Earl had sat since 1974. She did not ask God to save the farm. She had thought about it, the way you rehearse a prayer before you say it, and she had decided that asking God to save a piece of property did not feel like the right use of the conversation. What she asked instead was simpler. She asked whether she was supposed to fight or let go. She told God she genuinely did not know the answer, and that she was not going to pretend she did, and that she would need something more than silence before November. She did not get a thunderclap. What she got, driving home on Highway 2 with the blackjack oaks leafed out green on both sides and Earl's wheat coming up strong in the east field, was something she could not fully explain. Not certainty, not a sign, but closer to the sense that the question had been heard and that the answer would arrive through the doing of the thing, not before it. She called Dale that evening. She told him she was not selling. She told him she needed his business knowledge, not his permission. Dale was quiet on the line for a long moment. Then he said, "Okay, Mom, tell me what you're thinking." The meeting with Travis Kidd at First Farmers Bank happened on June 3rd, 1997. Ruth brought Connie and, after some telephone negotiation, Dale, who drove down from Tulsa that morning and spent the drive mentally reviewing the financial summary he'd built across 2 evenings the prior week. Cash flow projections, wheat crop estimates, updated land comparables from county records. He had not told Ruth it would work. He had told her it would show the bank they were serious people with a plan, which was a different thing, and, in a bank meeting, sometimes the more important thing. The branch was a 1-story brick building on Main Street that had been there since 1952. Ruth had been inside it 100 times. She had cashed checks here, opened certificates of deposit here, sat at that same loans desk in 1978 when she and Earl had refinanced the barn roof. Travis Kidd met them in the small conference room off the lobby. He was polite. He was not unkind. He was the kind of young man who expressed regret, incomplete, grammatically correct sentences, and had clearly been trained to communicate difficult decisions in a way that felt professional without feeling personal. He said the bank valued its relationship with the Maddox family. He said the note had been managed with considerable flexibility over the prior several years, and the bank genuinely appreciated the family's commitment to their obligations. Then he said the bank would require full collateral revaluation before it could consider renewal. He said the current balance, $130,400 with accrued interest, alongside the operational expenses the farm would need to carry through the next crop cycle, exceeded what the bank's current lending policy could support under a standard renewal structure. He said there were options. Option 1. Sell a portion of the acreage to reduce the principal before November. Option 2. Bring in a cosigner with off-farm income sufficient to offset the debt service. Option 3. Refinance under a new structure, longer term, higher rate, which would require a fresh appraisal and a full credit review of the estate. Connie asked what a partial sale would look like in terms of acreage. Kidd said the east 90 acres, the creek bottom, had been informally valued by area buyers before. He named a number, $47,000. Connie did not respond to that out loud. Ruth watched her daughter's jaw set in the particular way she recognized as Earl's jaw when someone said something he was not going to accept but had not decided yet how to answer. The east 90 acres were John Maddox's land. The 1931 purchase, the land that had started everything. Dale said, "We need time to evaluate the options." Kidd said, "You have until September 30th to notify us of your intended path. The collateral review will be completed by October 15th. The renewal decision will be made November 3rd. They drove home on Highway 2 in near silence. Somewhere past Clayton, Dale said, "The partial sale makes the math work." Connie said, "Granddad's land is not math." Dale said, "I know that, but it is to them." Neither of them said anything else for the rest of the drive. The wheat came in on June 18th. It was a good harvest, better than they'd had reason to expect given the spring, which had started dry and made up for it with 2 hard rains in May. 142 acres. Decent yield. The final elevator ticket came to $31,840. Ruth paid it directly against the loan balance as a principal reduction. The note came down to $98,600. It helped. It did not solve it. Through July and August, Connie worked the farm alone. Ruth helped where she could, rode the tractor on the early mornings before the heat got bad, kept the books the way Earl had kept them, but cleaner, made sure the paperwork was right. But Connie ran it. She baled hay from the north pasture, cut it 3 times through the summer, which was 1 more cut than they'd gotten in either of the 2 prior years, and sold it locally for $14,200. She found that Lester Pratt, a neighbor about 2 miles east, had been running some of his own equipment across 60 acres of their hay ground on an informal arrangement that had never been put in writing. Connie had a lease agreement drafted and signed by early August. $38 an acre, 60 acres, $2,280 for the season. She also culled 6 cows from the herd, older animals well past their productive years, and hauled them herself to the Etoka auction in late August. Between the hay sales, the lease income, the cow sales, and the wheat principal reduction, they had paid down an additional $19,000 since June. The balance stood at $79,600. Dale had run the numbers 3 times from Tulsa. He called Ruth on a Thursday evening in mid-September and was quiet for a second before he spoke, the way he got quiet when numbers came out better than he had expected. He said, "A conventional operating note renewal at $79,600 against 380 acres was actually within range. Not comfortable range, not a certainty, but within the territory of a loan decision a reasonable bank could make, especially if the farm's demonstrated earning capacity was properly documented." What Connie had produced in a single 6-month stretch under the worst possible circumstances, $48,000 in documented gross receipts, was not a small number. He drove down from Tulsa on the last weekend of September. The 3 of them sat at the kitchen table, the same oilcloth, the same chairs, the coffee in the same percolator Earl had bought at a hardware sale in 1984. Dale had sat at this table 5 months earlier and told his mother to sell. Ruth had sat at this table in April with a loan document she didn't know existed. Connie had sat at this table her whole life. They were not the same people. Not exactly. Dale wrote the financial summary, yield data, lease income, cattle sales, quarter-by-quarter cash flow. Connie wrote the farming narrative, what she had done when she had done it, what the operation looked like going forward, what the land could carry. Ruth wrote the cover letter by hand with a ballpoint pen at the kitchen table, the way she had written letters her entire married life. She did not beg. She described the farm's history from 1931. She listed Earl's 34 years of unbroken loan repayment at First Farmers Bank. She described what the family had accomplished in the 6 months since March. She told Travis Kidd that she understood business was business. She asked for the renewal, not as a favor, but as a decision her family had earned the right to request. She sealed the envelope and mailed it from the Antlers post office on October 1st. Then she drove home and cooked supper and went to bed, and she did not know what was going to happen, and she had decided that was all right. The collateral review came back on October 17th. The new appraisal put the 380 acres at $194,000, higher than what they had permitted themselves to hope for. A 40-acre parcel adjacent to the eastern boundary of the Maddox property had sold in August at a price that pulled the comparable values up slightly across the county. The appraiser, a man named Garland Webb who had been doing agricultural appraisals in southeastern Oklahoma for 20 years, had walked the property with Connie for half a day in early October. He had noted the condition of the pasture, the creek bottom, the barn, the winter wheat already established in the east field. His report described the property as well-maintained and actively managed. The bank's internal review committee met on October 28th. Travis Kidd called Ruth on October 31st. He said the committee had reviewed the estate's loan history, the 1997 operating season documentation, and the new appraisal. He said the balance of $79,600 against $194,000 in collateral, combined with the demonstrated cash flow from the operating season, was sufficient to support a renewal. He said there would be a rate adjustment, up half a point from Earl's last structure, to reflect current market conditions. Ruth said that was acceptable. She sat at Earl's desk after she hung up the phone. She did not cry. She sat in the same chair Earl had sat in every winter evening going over his records, and she looked at the desk the way you look at something familiar after you've been away from it, seeing it differently now. The manila envelope was still in the center drawer. She had not moved it since April. She took out Earl's note. Review meeting, First Farmers, November 1997. Renewal likely. Do not panic if I'm not here. Earl had thought renewal was likely. He had been right. What he could not have known when he wrote those words in January, what no one could have known, sitting alone at a desk that smelled of pipe tobacco and motor oil, was everything that would have to happen to make him right. The letter from Travis Kidd that would never get answered. The drawer that Ruth would finally open 3 weeks after his death. The Saturday when Dale drove down and sat at the kitchen table with the document spread out and said the hard thing that had to be said. The summer Connie spent cutting hay and pulling old lease arrangements into writing and hauling cattle to Atoka before the summer heat broke. The wheat in the east field, going into the ground in October like Earl had put it in, because Connie had planted it the same week Ruth found the envelope without being asked. The farm was not saved by grace falling out of the sky. It was saved by a wheat harvest in June and hay cut 3 times in summer heat and 60 acres of lease income and a few old cows and a letter written in ballpoint pen at a kitchen table. It was saved by a son who had kept his distance for 15 years, deciding that 6 months of distance was enough. By a daughter who had always been here. By a woman who had sat in the 4th pew at church on a Tuesday morning and asked a question she didn't have the answer to yet. Ruth folded Earl's note along the original crease and put it back in the envelope. She left it in the drawer where he had left it for her. Dale stayed through the first week of November. He fixed the fence along the south pasture, something Earl had been meaning to address since the prior summer, and helped Connie winterize the barn before the first cold front. That front came through on November 6th out of the northwest, the way the real cold always came in southeastern Oklahoma, arriving overnight and leaving the fields pale and stiff by morning. The three of them ate supper together that night in the kitchen. Beef stew from the chest freezer, cornbread from a cast-iron skillet Ruth had owned for 30 years. The heat was running for the first time since spring. Outside, in the east field, under half an inch of frozen ground, Earl's wheat was already down for the season. The new crop, the 1998 harvest. They didn't talk about the loan renewal at supper. They had talked about it enough. Dale said at some point while they were clearing dishes that he thought Connie ought to think about formalizing the operating arrangement for the farm going forward, a legal framework, an income structure, something that protected Ruth's ownership position and defined Connie's role in writing rather than by silent understanding. Connie said she'd look at that in January. Ruth said nothing. She watched her two children talk the way they had not talked in years. Not without disagreement, not without the specific friction that existed between people who had made different choices and knew it, but talking in the same room at the same table. She thought about Earl. She thought about loss making some things impossible and, strangely, making other things available that had not been available before. The farm was not the same farm it had been before March 14th. Ruth was not the same woman. Dale was not the same son. Connie was perhaps most nearly who she had always been, but she was standing differently. She had a folder of receipts and grain elevator tickets and lease agreements and auction records that told a story she was quietly, privately proud of in the way her father might have been proud, without saying so, without needing to say so. What the operating loan had cost them was not the farm. It had cost Earl something, had been part of what he'd been carrying, folded into the weight that a farming life accumulates over decades in the body and the books. It had cost Ruth 7 months of fear and grief braided so tightly together she still sometimes could not tell which one was which at 2 in the morning. It had cost Dale the comfortable distance he had maintained from this land and these people for 15 years, and whether he was glad to lose that distance or still grieving it, he probably did not know yet himself. It had cost Connie, in the end, nothing she had not already prepared to pay. But they had something now that they had not had before. Not the thing they had wanted. What they had wanted was Earl, standing in the drive with that half-skeptical, half-proud look when the truck from Tulsa pulled in, before he turned back toward the barn without ceremony. That they would not get back. That was the real cost, and no loan renewal changed it. But they had the wheat in the ground. They had 380 acres of red clay and blackjack oaks. They had the cedar-smelling barn that John Maddox had built in a county where the Depression had taken everything from everybody except the family stubborn enough to hold on. Ruth thought, going to bed on the night of November 6th with the wind picking up outside, that is worth something. It is not everything, but it is not nothing. Every time I sit with a story like Ruth's, I find myself thinking about the things people carry privately, the document in the desk drawer, the note written in January. The version of the truth someone keeps from the people who love them because they believe they are protecting those people, when really they're only carrying it alone. If you have ever found something you weren't meant to find, a loan paper, an old letter, a number that changed the shape of everything you thought you knew about someone, leave me a comment. I'd like to hear what that moment was like, when the picture shifted. And if you're carrying something the way Earl was carrying it, something you haven't told the person who most needs to know, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'll just say this. Earl ran out of time to tell Ruth himself. She found it anyway, and the finding, even through a drawer and a manila envelope and a note written in cautious January cursive, was still a kind of telling. And the family that came out the other side of 1997 was different from the one that went in. Not whole, but more honest, more present, more together in the way that costs something to become. This has been The Bank and the Barn. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more families like the Maddoxes, more desks like Earl's, more years like 1997. The land is still there.